Hi, I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the host and moderator of the Munk Dialogues. Thank you for joining us for our weekly program. For the last couple of weeks since the U.S. election, we've been focusing on the topic of liberal democracy, its future. How is it changing? How will it impact us? To do that, we've been going to a series of foreign correspondents, so to speak, to get a perspective outside of North America. We started with Martin Wolf in London, England. We then had Anne Applebaum last week coming from Poland, from Eastern Europe. This week, we're going to go right across the world to China, to Shanghai for an interesting and important voice. Before we go to our guest, I just want to remind viewers that the purpose of the dialogue is really to have an exchange of views. More importantly, to solicit the insights of our guests. If you want to debate on China, please go to the Munk Debate website. We've got lots of terrific debates on all kinds of issues related to China's relationship with the West, China's relationship to liberal democracy. Tonight's conversation, though, is a dialogue, and our guest is a big, big deal in China. His name is Zhang Weiwei. He's a professor of international relations at the Fudan University in Shanghai, one of China's most prestigious universities, focusing on international and global affairs. He served as an English language interpreter for Chairman Deng Xiaoping and other important Chinese leaders. He's the author of some hugely best-selling books in China that have also had an impact in the Western world, The China Wave and The China Horizon. Zhang Weiwei, thank you for coming on the Munk Dialogues tonight.
Thank you, it's a great pleasure.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. There's so much to unpack with you about China's role in the world, Canada-Chinese relations, but I want to start with the topic of democracy, and I want to get your view on how you, and more importantly, how the Chinese people are thinking about Western liberal democracy today, especially in the fallout of the U.S. election, a contentious election that continues to be contentious. What is the Chinese view of Western liberal democracy? And more importantly, what do you think's wrong with it?
Well, I think in general, the Western political system has its strengths and weakness. But increasingly, we see its weaknesses really outgrow its strengths. That's the general feeling here in China, including Chinese academics. And I always said, there are certain, sometimes I claim, genetic flaws in how democracy, liberal democracy has operated in the West. One is the assumption, human beings are rational. And this is now increasingly difficult to establish, given the involvement of money, the AI technology, rise of social media. So people are having more difficulty in being rational. The second is this rights are absolute. In the Chinese view, rights and responsibility should always be balanced. Otherwise, modern society cannot be run efficiently and well. And third weakness is its overemphasis on procedure, as if a procedure is right, then everything is right, is okay. Among our discussions here about Western political system, I submit the view, if you look at the Chinese way of governance, we have certain ideas I think the West could refer to. One is in the Chinese philosophy, we have a concept called the Ming-Yi, which is more or less similar to public opinion. The other is Ming-Xin. It's difficult to translate, but it's more or less similar to the idea of hearts and minds of the people, or the long-term and overall interest of your people. So this idea put forward by Mencius over 2,000 years ago. So in the West, we see this political model, increasingly governance based on public opinion, rather than long-term interests of the country and the people. So in Chinese case, we think governance by Ming-Xin is very important, long-term interests, hearts and minds of people. Public opinion may reflect, the long-term interest of people, but may not reflect, especially in this internet age, and everything is fleeting. Changes overnight. People's mood can be different, by hours. So sometimes, this idea of Mingxin and Mingyi could be useful in governance, at least we practice in China. And the other thing is that we always think, again, it's part of Chinese traditional philosophy. We have what's called a Dao, or overall purpose objectives, and then Shu, which is more specifics. So it's always specifics are governed by Dao, by this overall principle. That's why I wonder how whether the American political system or Western political system can engage in meaningful political reforms. One major obstacle is always this legal obstacle. I call this rigid legalism. For instance, gun control in the United States is supported by many people, perhaps more, large percentage of American population. Yet, in order to reform this, change this attitude towards gun control, you have to somehow amend this Second Amendment. That's the constitutional change and revision. Look at the procedures; it's humanly impossible. So, what can you do with reforms? You are blocked by this procedural rigidity. So I think perhaps we are very proud that we have a culture of learning. We want to learn everything great from other countries. We have learned a lot from Canada, from United States, from UK, and from other countries. But we try to be selective to learn and adapt to our Chinese situation. I think this time now, the West could look to China and learn something about its approach to governance. And after all, China is a country that has risen fast. If you look at the people's income over the past 4 decades,
right,
it's a 23-fold increase.
Just to jump in here a bit and expand on some of these ideas. So an interesting picture that you're painting here of a Chinese perception of Western liberal democracy as overly procedural, constitutionally rigid, unable to make long-term decisions. What is the view just in China simply of elections? I mean, when the Chinese watch the American election, what do they take away from that? Is that an experience that they say to themselves, well, wouldn't it be great if we could have elections every 4 to 5 years? Or do they look at that and say, this is something that's just so completely foreign and alien to our culture and how we think about governance in China?
China is the country that invented the public service examination system, what we call the Keji system in Sui Dynasty over 1,000 years ago. So Chinese system is more or less based on what we call the selection. And today it will be called selection plus election. That's the Chinese political model, how we elect our leaders. And overwhelming emphasis is placed on your performance prior to your current position. For instance, if you want to be a member of the top 7 top leadership in the Chinese system, in most cases, it requires 2 terms as governor number 1 of a Chinese province. Given the size of China, it means literally you have governed over 100 million people before you come to be have this qualification for being nominated for this position, 1 out of 7. So indeed, based on that, really, we think the U.S. system is a bit, how should we put it? To be frank, it will not work very well. Yeah.
Tell us, because this is really, I find this fascinating because, again, as Westerners, I don't think we often appreciate this enough about China. The system of selection, that there's a view in China that you've been at governance, not since the Communist Revolution, quite the contrary. You've been working on a system of governance literally for something close to 2 millennia. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why the Chinese, in your view, really accept that as part of the legitimacy of the system writ large?
Most probably, in China's long history, It's already a unified country since 221 BC. So it's already over 2,000 years as a unified country in most cases. So China is, since then, always a large country, a continental country, a civilization. I call this civilizational state. It's made up of hundreds of states into one over its long history. So given this large population and challenges for governance, and also in terms of resources per capita, it's much fewer than most other countries. So somehow people generate this culture for meritocracy, for governance. So the Chinese invented this, relatively neutral government based on competent leaders selected through examinations of all kinds. So in the end, this is part of Chinese culture. So it's inconceivable, the Chinese will accept someone like, not mentioning Donald Trump, even Obama, or even George Bush, W. Bush. By Chinese standards, slightly below the bar. It lacks enough experience of governance. Yeah.
This is fascinating. And when the Chinese think about, again, liberal democracy, and they think about the attributes of it that they might admire, what would those be? I mean, is there, excuse my ignorance here, but I'm just trying to understand, is there a view in China around the importance of individual freedom? Do people say to themselves, part of how I want to live my life, to experience day-to-day existence, is as an individual defining my identity and being clear about that as one of my core tenets and beliefs? Is that something that's broadly held in China, and is it at all admired when they see, I guess, often at times in a very chaotic and sometimes shambolic way, that vision, that ideal being pursued in countries like the United States?
Yeah, for Chinese, really, it's sometimes, mind-boggling why the Western values give top priority to so-called freedom. It must be the reason that they did not have enough freedom for a long time. When they have this freedom, they cherish it. In China's long history, if you look at the land system, people can buy and purchase land in most cases. So economically, it's freer than the same period of time in Europe. And we have a saying, because it's a continental country, the saying is, it's an ancient saying called the emperor is far, mountain is high and emperor is far away. And individual freedom is immense, So we just wonder why this can be a top priority in the Western culture. We did some interesting surveys among the Chinese societies, whether it's Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, or Chinese mainland. If you list the priorities of values, let's suppose there are so-called universal values. But due to cultural differences, there are certain priorities in the mind of people. In the case of Chinese culture, social order is always the top one priority. In the United States, we check this study, it's always the freedom of speech. And although we all know in a politically correct society, freedom of speech is quite limited, especially in daily life, not to mention political life.
Tell us about the view in China of movements like Black Lives Matter and the kind of reckoning on race that we're seeing here now in North America, to some extent in Europe. What is the view in China of this struggle in the West to try to reconcile minorities with the majority and to try to unsuccessfully at times, but nonetheless to try to integrate minorities into a dominant Western culture in ways that allow those minorities to sustain their traditions, their values, their interests and beliefs? What's the Chinese view on that?
no, this is a challenge for the Western societies, especially for the United States. I think it's more than just a racial relationship. It's also economical. I've been to the United States many times, and very often this racial divide is also based on where you live, where your residence is, where your education is received, and where your job is. So all these are deeply entrenched. So I think there must be tremendous effort to really establish a kind of harmony or relationship between different races, ethnic groups. And indeed, for over, quite a few decades, say in the American society, in many other Western countries as well, you find this identity politics, which is divisive. I remember having a conversation with Professor Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, just 1 month ago. We discussed the need for this kind of reform in racial relations. And then he mentioned this success example of American reforms in the 1930s, 1960s, Great Deal and the Great Society, etc. I said, at that time in the United States, the middle class was expanding, was growing. So middle class was a driving force for these social reforms. But today, middle class in the United States is shrinking. And then with this identity politics, middle class is very much divided. So it's more difficult to reform now. It's a huge challenge for the Western societies now. Yeah.
There's so much I'd like to spend the whole hour with you, but I'm not going to be greedy. I'm going to have to go to audience questions here because we've had a lot for you, Weiwei, in anticipation of this broadcast, and also as we're live here, people can send their questions to us. We'll get that question email up for you on the board, dialogues@munkdebates.com. Send those questions in, and we'll put them to our distinguished guest. Weiwei, the first question comes from Tom. It was emailed in, and I'll read it to you. It says, in the West, we generally have one opinion of a country and another opinion of their present government. I think of China this way too, i.e. a country with a rich, long history and a relatively recent turn to communism. Is there room for more than one path beyond communism when talking of China's future? Give us views on that. You're a member of the Chinese Communist Party, so obviously you have strong feelings and beliefs here. But I'd like your thoughts as to, is communism now integral to China's future development? Could you imagine a China without the Communist Party as its central organizing body and institution?
It's a misnomer to call China a communist country. It's a socialist country led by a Chinese Communist Party. And we should add, to understand modern China today, it's essential to have a basic understanding of the CPC, Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. And it's, on the whole, an overwhelmingly positive force for China. So this in China is common sense. So without this knowledge, you have all kinds of misreading of China.
Okay.
Well, one major reason, as I said, China is a country amalgamated from hundreds of states into one over its long history. So in China's long history of the past 2,000 years, it's always governed by one unified ruling entity. You may call, one-party system. So the CCP is a continuation and development of that tradition. Otherwise, the country broke up. China tried the American political system in the 1911, what we call Republican Revolution. It ended up degenerating into civil wars between warlords, and millions of people lost their lives. So this is a huge lesson. And then what's more important is I submit the view many years ago that China has found its way to success, to modernization. And this model is not perfect, but it's indeed working well for China. It can compete with the Western model. China is not afraid of competition between political systems and models. And I can give a quick summary of this model. Politically, as I mentioned just now, it's about selection plus election. Economically, it's a mixed economy. And socially, it's the dynamic interaction between the state and society. On the whole, it's working well. That's why we have witnessed the rise of China. So, yes, I remember Secretary of State Pompeo. He still has a few days to go. He claimed, oh, China is a Marxist country. Don't be frightened by that, or communist country. It's Sinicized. It's like a Buddhism entry into China and Sinicized, became Chinese Buddhism. This Marxism is also Chinese Marxism. It's a reflection of many things interesting in China's own modernization. For one thing, China, thanks to this Chinese version of Marxism and the leadership of the CCP, China has become a unified country and move on stage by stage and make its progress today. So don't think China is another Soviet Union. It's totally different. It's the world's largest trading nation with the world's largest middle class, 400 million people, real middle class. When they go to Canada, they're also middle class. And so this kind of country, it cannot be a rigid Stalinist country. No, it's totally different.
Good. Okay, good points to make. That's what we're here to do tonight, to learn from you, to get your perspective. And again, I just want to remind viewers that the Munk Dialogues are meant to be that, a dialogue. This is not a debate. If you want to have a debate on China, go to our website. We've got a lot of them. In fact, Weiwei was in a terrific debate on liberal democracy versus the China model with our friend Timothy Garton Ash. That's on our website. Today we're having a dialogue, though, not a debate. I've got a question here that's come in from GB saying, and it kind of builds on what you just concluded with there, Weiwei. What do you see as the major differences for average people living in he says communist, but let me say socialist China versus capitalist societies in the West in 2020? What do you see as just help us understand China that way by painting some of those differences, and maybe give us your view of why you think this speaks in favor of the China model.
Yeah. And if you look at this statistics, let's compare, say, China, United States. I use, say, a criteria called the median net household assets. Let's look at the figure for last year. In the United States, it's close to $100,000, about $97,000. In the case of China, for urban households, it's already more than double that of the United States. It's over $200,000 US. So it's a revolution. And of course, this is about urban family, urban household, but this already means 700 million people, more than double the US population. We do have figure for the countryside, for rural areas, but we'll have them perhaps next year. Then we can make a comparison. It's net household assets at median level. Then if you look at Shanghai and New York, if you look at the nominal GDP per capita, New York is 4 times higher than Shanghai. Shanghai is roughly $20,000, and United States is New York is $80,000. Yet, if you look at the net household assets at median level, Shanghai is higher. If you look at the life expectancy, Shanghai is 4 times higher. Shanghai is 83. New York is 79. If you look at the street safety, Shanghai is at least 10 times better. Yeah. Then you can also look at the opinion surveys, whatever done by the major Western institutions like PW, like Ipsos, like Asia Barometer. Chinese also, most Chinese, say in the case of Ipsos last year, 91% Chinese think their country is on the right track. So the case for United States is about 40%. For UK, it's 21%. So indeed, sometimes I just wonder why the Western media do not have this courage to tell this simple truth that most Chinese feel good about their country, feel good about whatever progress they have made. So this is a basic fact. And if we get this clear, then everything becomes clearer.
Mm-hmm. Kishore Mahabani, a Munk debater, once made a great point that 100 million Chinese leave every year on vacation, business traveling around the world. 100 million Chinese come back every year to China after those vacations. Again, a reflection that these people are not living in the Soviet Union. They're not. Million. Yeah, they're not fleeing. For reasons that we understood obviously existed for people behind the Iron Curtain. Here's a question from Alan. It's a challenging one. He's asking, it's difficult to ignore the charges that the Central Chinese government is engaging in large-scale oppression of its Turkic-speaking Uyghur population. What does this approach to internal governance say about Chinese values and, by extension, the Chinese model? Could you talk to us about that? I mean, it gets a lot of coverage here in the Western media.
Most Chinese don't buy this assertion. We think it's Western propaganda, maybe more or less created by CIA and its associates. And from a Chinese point of view, the United States has already made a mess of Iraq, made a mess of Iran, made a mess of Afghanistan, made a mess of Syria and Libya. Now they want to make a mess of Xinjiang and Hong Kong. We'll not allow this to happen. Yeah, and given the so many terrorist attacks over the past many years, certain temporary restrictions are understandable. That happens in all law-abiding countries. And yet you look at the tremendous progress in Xinjiang. Over the past 3 years, not a single terrorist attack. That's great. And last year, we witnessed 200 million tourists go to Xinjiang, unprecedented in Xinjiang's history. So with this kind of broad picture, you will see better understanding. And also try to make another point of view. If you look at the level of modernization in Xinjiang, it's more developed than all its neighboring countries in Central Asia. Eventually, hopefully, perhaps within 10 years or slightly longer than that, Xinjiang may become the most developed economy in a region or in the world where Islam plays a predominant role. So that will be tremendous of contribution that Chinese and in Xinjiang can make to the international community. Yeah.
Just to build on that, I mean,
the Islamic world needs a modernized country, super modern economy. Yeah.
In the West, there's a thing we like to tell ourselves, and it's partly true, certainly, that diversity is a strength, that we like to live in pluralistic societies where different cultures coexist. You had previously talked in this interview, our conversation with you, about the diversity of China, its regional diversity, its cultural diversity. How do the Chinese think about diversity internally? Is it something that's celebrated, or is it something that's seen as an obstacle to the progress of the state and the progress of China writ large?
Actually, both Western societies and Chinese society are pluralistic. By culture and by social history, China is a very diverse country. We have 56 ethnic groups. And I remember in my debate with Professor Ash, I mentioned, China's civilizational state. If you look at the cultural differences between a typical guy from Shanghai, Shanghainese, and Pekingese and Cantonese, in fact, this gap could be larger than typical French, typical German, and typical Englishman. Yet we live under one civilization over thousands of years. So people appreciate this kind of diversity. And we see this diversity in harmony or harmony in diversity. And also the Chinese culture, I think one great thing about Chinese culture is this level of moderation. It's unlike the West. You assert your rights. It's absolute. No whatever concession. The Chinese thing is there must be limits. There must be rights and responsibility. So the Chinese culture is diversity in unity. The country is very diversified, yet it's also a unified country. So we are good at this. In French, we say mélange, everything in one. But in one is important. This diversity makes things splendid. See, when you travel within China, you fly for 3 hours, like Canada's a great country, and you see cultural differences. Each region has its own culture, its food, its music, its dialect, it's diverse. Yet, most people think we're all Chinese. That's important. Yeah.
Okay, good to note. A question here, shifting our conversation more to China's relationship to the world and vice versa. Dan asks, is China's system of governance suitable for other countries with a different history and different culture than China? Specifically, does China want to export its model to the developing world as an alternative to Western liberal democracy? I mean, you've spoken very passionately and in glowing terms about the benefits of the Chinese approach. So I guess it leads me to wonder, well, is this something that you'd like to see the rest of the world embrace for their own progress and development, maybe for China's interests also?
In fact, one striking difference between Chinese culture and Western culture in general is we don't have this messianic tradition to convert others. The Chinese philosophy is, yes, if our model is great, and we'll be more than happy to share our experience, features our Chinese model with you, but we never try to impose this model on others. We will say you can refer to our model if necessary, but if you're not interested, we do not care much about it. So this is a very open-minded attitude towards this what's called a China model. It's very different from the American approach. American believe that their model is the best and imposed on others, whether by espionage or by missiles. We don't have this tradition. So Chinese is age-old civilization, perhaps slightly more sophisticated. We think eventually each and every nation should find its own way to success, which will be different from others. But once you are successful or relatively successful, many other countries will look to you for some kind of help or even guidance. That is happening. In Africa, you see this slogan called looking east, looking to China. But that's not something China imposed on others. We're not interested. But indeed, if we share experiences and what we call the selective learning, Chinese have learned so much from the West, but selectively, not blindly copy the Western system. That will be okay. Yeah.
And how would you respond to those, including Mike Pompeo, you brought him up earlier in our conversation, who point to the One Belt, One Road initiative as an exercise to export more than just economic prosperity, ostensibly, to the participating countries that will be part of that global infrastructure system that China is leading to build really across your region, across Asia, into Europe, that in fact has a political dimension, that it has ideas embedded in it around governance and how societies should organize themselves?
Well, this BRI initiative is, at this moment, the world's largest, you may say, public goods offered by China. It's based on, I think, a very positive principle. It's called the discussing together, building together, benefiting together. You, out of your own interest to join this project, China does not force you to join it. Behind this is a huge gap in the developing world with rich countries. there is a huge shortage of infrastructure, from roads, railways, airports, to all kinds of telecommunications, IT technologies. Yet, for many, many decades, international institutions, many of them are dominated by Western approach, somehow ignore this huge demand for developing countries. So China come to feel this kind of gap, which is on the whole well received by most countries. I hope that the other countries will also join. Actually, some European companies, some American companies also join these projects. It's indeed a platform. And of course, in the process, certain countries say, well, come to help us because you have a great idea of these industrial zones. Can we also learn something to set up some zones here in our country? And China tried to help. And also China is good at make plans. Some country will say, well, help us with the planning. Actually, these are open for all countries, but China somehow is appreciated by other countries for that. So if you think this is expansion of Chinese political role, why not? So this is only normal. It's between states on sovereign rights. China respects their sovereignty. China does not impose its view on other countries. So this is also business as well. Yeah. So I don't see any problem with that. Don't politicize everything. One secret of China's success is in the West, it's started with the British, what we call the divide and rule. We always have good guy, good country, bad country, then opposing each other. The Chinese philosophy is unite and prosper, whether within China, in the international community. We said to Africans, unite, African unity, we support. Southeast Asia, ASEAN, unite, the more united, the better. So this is not the mentality of a colonialist, imperialist. This is the mentality of international community. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Tamara has a question for you. She asks, this is emailed into us, China has antagonized many in Europe, Asia, and North America with its, quote, wolf pack diplomacy. I'll let you characterize what that is. Why does a strong and secure nation behave like this? And I guess it's going to, we've seen a bit of that here in Canada too, Weiwei, a much more assertive tone, to put it politely, on the part of Chinese officials. How do you characterize that? How should we interpret it? Is it important?
No, as a Chinese, we are used to being lectured by the West and by the Western media.
Fair
point. Perhaps the West should also get used to a bit Chinese lecturing back.
Here, okay.
If that's the wolf-like diplomacy, I don't know. Maybe their approach could be more sophisticated.
Right.
But on the whole, I think China's position on international affairs are appreciated by most countries, not by many Western countries, but the Western countries are a minority in the world, in international community, although their influence is big. If you look at the United Nations debate on human rights, Human Rights Council, even on the issue of Xinjiang, issue of Hong Kong, most members support Chinese position, usually more than double the numbers supporting the Western position on these issues.
Okay. Good answer. Greg asks, it's terrific. We're getting through a lot of questions here, Weiwei. I really appreciate that. Greg,
no problem.
Greg asks you, Donald Trump changed U.S. politics on China from a consensus on cooperation to a consensus on rivalry. Do Chinese thinkers see this change in U.S. attitudes as permanent, transitory, or irrelevant to China's growth? That's a great question, Greg. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. From my point of view, whether it's consensus on rivalry with China, or opposing China in many fronts, or even this new Cold War, so-called, I think ultimately, the two countries like China and the United States must find a way for peaceful coexistence and cooperation. I look at this political agenda for Joe Biden. He made in his campaign speech. He said the four major challenges for the United States: unprecedented economic recession, unprecedented pandemic, unprecedented climate change and also unprecedented racial divide. Now, on racial divide, we cannot do much about it. But on the other three fronts, pandemic, economic recession, and climate change, the United States needs China's help. So I hope that eventually, if Joe Biden comes to power, he will realize this, and his team, supposedly more mature, because I remember Joe Biden said jokingly about Donald Trump, Donald, please grow up. So I hope with this adult, mature leadership with Joe Biden or his team, our two countries can find enough rooms of cooperation. There'll be competition, areas of competition, but there are also a lot of areas for cooperation. I think that will be the right approach, a more sophisticated, mature approach.
What would be the red lines for China in terms of Biden policy? What would the Chinese government simply not accept? There's talk of some recreation of a 20th century League of Democracies to push back against China's rise. I mean, it's one thing to push back. It would be another thing to, let's say, try to contain China, to try to stop your rise to global superpower status. What are the red lines for China right now?
Well, this so-called democracy alliance, I don't think it will work. For one thing, China is not an ideological power. China has no interest in exporting its ideology. And of course, we don't want others to impose its ideology on China either. So China is the world's de facto largest economy by purchasing power parity. And China has the world's largest middle class, 400 million people. And China is also now at the frontier of the fourth industrial revolution, cutting edge of new technologies. And China also has the world's largest foreign exchange reserves. And China is also with the world's largest, what you call the supply chain, whatever, within China. So I don't think, China is also the largest trading partner for over 130 countries. So for this kind of huge economy and civilizational state, there's no way to contain it. There's no way to forge an alliance against a country like that. I remember Henry Kissinger said just a few days ago, it's not to build an alliance against China in that way. That's not the right approach. I think it will not work either. Yeah.
Kissinger also, a former Munk debater himself, made some remarks this autumn warning the world about a kind of pre-World War I type scenario that we could be in here, of a rivalry between China and the United States that becomes, that spirals and that becomes unhinged from real interests, leading to the potential for conflict, possibly military conflict. Do you see that as all possible? Do the Chinese think about this as a possible end game that needs to be scenarioed out, so to speak?
And Henry Kissinger is an elder statesman, and with his age and his personal experience, obviously, his words count, and we can see a lot of wisdom in his remarks. Both international community and China and the United States should prevent this, what he called a World War I scenario. And but his remarks also reminds me of some remarks made by British philosopher Bertrand Russell when he came to China soon after the First World War. At that time, China was defeated since the Opium War in 1840s. And China intellectuals, said we should copy the Western political system, Western economic system, Western military system, and make China strong. But he counseled China. He said, we have just experienced this First World War. It's the madness of he said, Western militarist culture. He said, actually, he admired very much Chinese culture for this admiration for peace. And then he made one point, which I think is very sensible. He said that he believed one day China will be able to, it will be capable of self-defense. At that time, China was not capable of self-defense. Today, China has this capability for self-defense, very powerful capability. So now, as he said, Chinese culture for peace will be a tremendous asset for the international community. I think now this is the time China can make contributions about this peace. Indeed, we put forward this idea of shared future for mankind. It's serious, I wonder if only the United States, Donald Trump, could have, agree to this concept, say not 100%, say 20% or 30%. He could have handled this pandemic 10 times better. He could counsel WHO for cooperation, for advice. He could counsel Chinese for cooperation, for advice. He could have done much, much better, but he did not have this sense. Eventually, it's the indeed interdependent international community as this COVID-19 shows. People have to help each other, otherwise there's no way out.
Mm-hmm. You must hear this a lot. I mean, there's a perception in some parts of the West here of a hawkish military in China, that there has emerged in China a group who are looking for more direct confrontation with the United States to assert China's rights, and especially in the South China Sea, but more generally, to demonstrate to the world that indeed China has risen to global superpower status. Is that a misperception of the Chinese military and how it thinks about its primary rival, the United States?
And in fact, in all major countries, even small countries, you always have a diversity of opinions, some more hawkish, some less hawkish, some very peaceful. So this is a part of the society. China is no different from other countries. But China is indeed, offended these days by the American aggressive approach. You have the espionage planes day in, day out, close Chinese borders, Chinese facilities. And they have this selling of advanced missiles, weapons to Taiwan, which Chinese view it as naturally part of Chinese territory. And so all these kind of aggressive gestures really offends China. And we understand that it has to do with the campaign politics and with Donald Trump's need for election. He need to divert people's attention from his domestic problems, troubles with the pandemic. But that's not the right way, not mature leadership. China has shown tremendous restraint. Otherwise, it could be dangerous. China is a nation which has a long tradition of admiring for peace. For instance, we build great walls rather than, invading other countries. When China was 100 times stronger than European powers in the 15th century, and when China sent its navy to Africa, to South China Sea, we did not colonize any country. It's not in our gene, in our blood. We think people can coexist peacefully rather than bullying each other, strong bullying the weak. That's not our mentality. When China first exploded its nuclear device in 1964, China announced to the international community, China will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. China will not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Given China today's military capability, we can recover all the lost islands in South China Sea overnight. But we did not do that. We prefer negotiated settlement with Chinese neighboring countries. If you look at the United States, in the late 19th century, when the United States became the largest economy in around 1890s, the United States launched this war against Spain and occupied Cuba and Philippines. So Chinese approach is very different. We prefer, we are very cautious on the use of military power. This is based in Chinese old philosophy Sun Tzu. You must be very cautious on matters of war. And so this is good for international community. I hope the United States could learn something from that. I remember Jimmy Carter said, when he answered a phone call from Donald Trump, he said, why China is surpassing us? He said, over the past 250 years, the United States fought all the time, wars and wars and wars, only 16 years without wars. But look at China. In the past 4 decades, no war launched by China. So that makes all the difference. We put money into infrastructure, into technologies, and that makes all the difference. But of course, China has its red lines, which no country can cross. Otherwise, there will be military conflict.
Before we go to your book recommendations, as we do with each dialogue participant, I want to ask a question from Margaret here about Canada. Actually, sorry, this is not Margaret, my mistake. Kristen is asking a question from email. She's asking, what should Canada do vis-a-vis its relations with China? We are witnessing increased tensions. 2 Canadians are currently being held in China on espionage charges. We have a senior Chinese telecom executive being detained here in Canada on an FBI warrant. What is your advice, Weiwei, to not just Canada, but maybe smaller countries that are increasingly pressured between you and the United States, frankly, to take sides, to pick a lane? What should Canada do?
In general, for say, a small country or medium-sized countries, the United States want to force this country to have a choice either with China or with the United States, or so-called against us or with us. And this is never the Chinese mentality. Our mentality is every country is a friend or potential friend. That's very much in the Chinese tradition. Even now we have troubles as with Canada, but in the long run, perhaps we can again become great friends. It's a slightly, a pity that, Canada on the whole has a very good reputation among the ordinary Chinese. We think among all the Western countries, Canada is one of those who have, on the whole, very good relation with China for almost 5 decades, if my memory is not wrong. But this case of Huawei's Meng Wanzhou really hurts most Chinese, because Huawei is such a presence in China, and people are really offended. And even legally speaking, we think Canada should have its guts, and it's like human being. You have certain principles to adhere to, rather than become accomplice for the United States. From my examination of this case, very superficial knowledge, in Canadian law, you have this double criminality. Obviously, this Iran case, sanction against Iran, is not, at that time at least, does not violate Canadian law. So obviously, it's a political plot to stifle Huawei and stifle China's tech growth, but it will not work. I remember former Canadian Prime Minister Chrétien and some of his colleagues, former leading politicians, scholars from Canada, all urged for release of Meng Wanzhou. I hope Canada will do that. And you will have enough room, in retrospect, you have enough room with the Canadian wisdom and diplomacy. You can find an approach, on the one hand, maintain good relations with China. On the other hand, do not offend the United States, even under Donald Trump, have some way to do this. Many other countries have found a way, small countries, can do that. Why Canada cannot? I think there's a chance to do that. Hopefully we'll release Meng Wanzhou as soon as possible.
Okay, well, thank you for that synopsis. Well, let's go to your book recommendations, because this is really an opportunity for our readers to get inside your head here and understand what are the books that you would suggest for people to dig into to try to understand China today and try to understand this moment we're in. So I'm going to read you each title, and if you could just give me a quick synopsis of why you're recommending them. The first book is China Reconnects, Joining a Deep-Rooted Past to a New World Order.
Yeah, this is by a leading scholar called Wang Gongwu, and he's indeed, in his particular book, he discussed in quite at length and also in broad stroke this overall picture of China and other countries, how China has learned from the West, from other countries. At the same time, China begins to find its own roots. So this reconnects. So China is part of the international community. At the same time, China is a unique country with its own civilization, and it's different from others. So this is a very interesting, fascinating reading for readers, I hope. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great to share with us. The next book is A Short History of Chinese Philosophy. That interests me. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, this is already a classic by a leading Chinese philosopher who died many years ago. But he's so far, I think, one of the best book succinctly discussing history of Chinese philosophy. In this book, particularly, I think it's worth reading his discussion on the idea of relation between Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and other religions and philosophies within China. So one striking feature in Chinese cultural tradition is what we call the different religions can exist simultaneously, coexist and borrow from each other. So China, one of very few countries in the world that without it did not have experienced major religious conflict or religious wars. So different religions coexist and collaborate with each other. That's what we call the diversity in harmony. Yeah.
Great. And your final recommendation is Redefining a Philosophy for World Governance.
Yeah, this is also by a contemporary Chinese philosopher, Zhao Tingyang, and his idea of discussing this Chinese old idea called Tianxia, all under heaven. And this is at least illuminating for others to know the traditional Chinese thinking and how the Chinese thinking can be brought into the contemporary international relations and international systems. In other words, different countries, different political values, different political systems can all exist and then borrow ideas from each other, learn from each other, and then all under heaven. It's a tremendous proposition for peaceful coexistence and development. Yeah.
And Weiwei, these books are all available through our book partner, Indigo. Just go to the indigo.ca website. You can also see other recommendations and Weiwei's books in English that you can purchase, The China Wave and The China Horizon. Weiwei, I really want to thank you for this conversation today. Canada-Chinese relations are at a moment of tension, but just in this dialogue, I think there's so much from us to learn from each other. There's so much, frankly, for me to learn about China and how the Chinese are thinking about this moment that we're all living through, the big challenges that are facing us globally, internationally, and as fellow citizens of our respective countries. So I just want to thank you for the civility and the substance with which you've engaged in your dialogue with us tonight.
Thank you, Ridyard, for your very kind invitation and for our very fascinating dialogue, which will go well with, hopefully, a Chinese international audience. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Weiwei. We'll talk again soon.